Everyone. Today we are going to talk about Magic the Gathering's influence on customizable card game standards and how some of Magic the Gathering's initial design missteps and their later corrections helped achieve those standards in general for customizable card games, and some of those can be felt to this day. Let's get started. So we'll go over the 1993 rules of Magic the Gathering at launch. We'll go over the updated rules they have, including the tournament rules in 1994. We'll talk about what those rules tried to fix and change and why. And we'll talk about how all of these rules ended up making deck lists required for tournaments. We'll talk about the practical realities that prevented full deck swappings at a tournament, as well as the sideboard compromise that arose because of that. And we'll have a summary, of course. So, to understand why the rule sets for most customizable card games or trading card games, or whatever kind of term you want to use, but basically you have a deck of cards for a game and you use those primarily to play. You can see this in Star Wars, Pokemon, you can see this in Yu-Gi-Oh!, Lord of the Rings, CCG, Flesh and Blood nowadays, Disney's Lorcana. And to understand why some of the rules for those are what they are, we need to understand how Magic the Gathering came to its own rules and how those rules and standards in turn affected all CCGs that came after it. Now, it launched, it certainly had different rules than today. So, in the rules itself, it said that people need to decide ahead of time, is this a best of one or best of three? And they kind of use the term of a duel, right? A duel is one game, and a match is kind of two or best of three, and you need to decide, like I said, and there's a link to that document there. Now, decks back then were 40 card minimums. There were no maximums. And basically it just goes on to say that you can use counters for life tokens, but you need at least two different decks for two different people to play against each other. And there's a link again. Now, games were played with ante by default. And so you start the game by shuffling your deck, cut your opponent's deck, drawing 7 cards. And then afterwards, you would retrieve all your cards, but if there was an ante, that would be taken by the winner. And so basically what happens is that when you first start the game, the top deck of the card would be the ante card, put those aside. So whatever your deck was, it would always be your deck minus 1 card, because 1 would be the ante, and whoever won that game would get it at the end. Now, one thing about the ante is it's any card. So the ante could be a Black Lotus, the ante could be a basic land, could be plain. So there was some wide variety in what could be the ante card. There were a few cards in alpha/beta that dealt with ante. They were black cards, basically. And these are 2 examples below. These are both very, very powerful cards. And you can find a link to them there. They did say, of course, variant games do not have to use ante. So by mutual consent, players don't have to play ante. So the default is you do play for ante, but if you both agree not to play for ante, then you don't have to. They did say that you could decide to play ante anyway, but not play for keeps. So for instance, you might have 3 games. Maybe you won game 1, you put that opponent's card into your deck, you play game 2 with that new different card. And then maybe the opponent would win game 2 and they would take one of your cards in their deck. And so some of the idea behind this was to have cards switching and making the decks a little bit more dynamic and trying to add some interest to it. One interesting thing about this is this could have been some of the inspiration for the Sabak mechanic from Star Wars CCG, because if you won a game of Sabak and one of those cards was a stake card, it would automatically go to your opponent's deck. It would become part of their deck, despite having a different back or whatever. Obviously, at the end of the game in Star Wars CCG, you would give back the card your opponent owned, but the idea of continuing your game with a stolen card from your opponent is an interesting idea that inspired other mechanics. Most likely. Here's a link to that as well. Now, Magic the Gathering launched August 5th, 1993, and very soon after, it held its first tournament at Gen Con in 1993 from August 19th to August 22nd. Here's a picture of the attendees, and this is Townsend on the left and his opponent on the right. And although antes was part of the rules, most likely it actually wasn't used for the first tournament. There were no rules against deck switching, although probably no one did do that. And probably no deck lists were there at all, because if there were deck lists, we would probably know what those decks were. There is a transcript of the event. Just a note that Orcish Oriflame was one of the key cards for the winner of that event. There were no, like we mentioned earlier, card copy limits. Have as many as anything you want to, and theoretically you could kind of abuse the Power 9 cards, but no one actually did. There is an interview with the finalist Rick Townsend there, and you can kind of see the play-by-play at this link. Now, in 1994, in January, they kind of released an updated rule set for Magic the Gathering. So they had a new rules saying you have a limited list, max 1 of copy. All other cards, maximum 4. 60 card deck, up from 40. Anti-specific cards are banned, but they did kind of allude to it. If both players consent to anti, you can play with anti, and it was the opposite earlier, right? Both players had to agree not to do anti. Now it's the opposite. Both players have to agree for anti. Players have to use the same deck throughout, was the rule, and they introduced a optional 15-card sideboard to switch cards back and forth in a 1-for-1 rate. And you can kind of see the old rules there. Now, let's talk about some of these rules kind of and why. So why do they make a new limited card list, max of 1 per deck? Here's kind of some of the, what they mentioned there, kind of explaining this limited list. And so these were some of the cards they listed here. Maybe at the time they felt these were kind of too powerful. Orcish Oriflame was later eroded to be kind of 4 mana casting. Ice Manipulator can be annoying. In my opinion, though, these are not really the issue cards. These are not the real problem cards. The real problem cards, in my mind, are these cards, which colloquially we know today as the Power 9. And so we should kind of understand a little bit more what was possible, could be possible with kind of the old rules. So let's make a 40-card deck. That's pretty much the only restriction in the past. So you could have 18 Black Lotuses. You could have 18 Time Twisters. Let's say you had 2 Time Walks. And let's say you had 2 Juggernauts for creatures. And so the basic idea is that, Black Lotus, you sacrifice to add 3 mana. And then basically you can cast Time Twister, which shuffles everything in the graveyard back into the deck. And so you can use these again. And so basically what this does is between Black Lotus and Time Twister, you're more likely to get all your Black Lotuses or many of them on play. And then when you sacrifice 1, you can use a Time Twister, keep shuffling your deck until you get the cards you really want, which is your Juggernaut, your Time Twister. So because you have to use antis, you need to have an extra card. So we have 2 Time Walks because all we need is 1. We have 2 Juggernauts, all we need is 1. And the idea is that we will deploy our Juggernauts, cast them, get on the field, and we'll have lots of excess Time Walks. And then basically what we'll do doing that is that once we get our Juggernauts in play, we have 50 million extra turns. We'll just stack up those extra turns, keep on attacking Juggernaut until the opponent is dead with life equals 0 or more. There are other ways to abuse, this basic idea. You could use Black Lotuses and Time Twisters and Time Walks, but you could use Fireball. So you would do the basic same thing of you'd loop your Black Lotuses to cast Time Twisters, to cast it again until you get all the cards you need. And in this particular case, you can use buffer turns for Time Walk, but really you're just trying to get 8 Black Lotuses in play so that you can cast Fireball for X equals 20, and you can instantly kill your opponent. So your opponent will never get a turn to play if you play first. Most likely, it is theoretically possible to draw 7 Black Lotuses or 7 Time Twisters or not be able to win turn 1, but most likely you will. There are other things you can do. You can do like Brain Geyser and Black Vise. You can do the same basic idea, except this time you repeat the loop enough times so that you cast a Black Vise, and then when you have enough Black Lotuses, you sacrifice those to cast a Brain Geyser. Your opponent has 50 million cards in their hand, and then when they start the turn for each card they have in hand above 4, they take 1 damage. Well, if your opponent has, let's say enough cards above 4, they will die instantly. So basically they have 25 cards or so, they will just be dead. So that kind of explains the limited list. And why do they do a limited list? Well, largely because they didn't want to ban these cards yet, right? So the compromise solution for this is to just say, all right, we know these cards are really powerful. We know they can combo well. Let's just have 1 maximum, and we'll go with that. try that. Now, the issue is, of course, is that if they printed the Power 9, if they printed broken cards or broken interactions, could that happen again? And that was the fear. And so what they did is they implemented a new rule saying that for all other cards, you can have a maximum of 4 copies of that card. Previously it was infinite. So this is a mitigation method against future cards that are too powerful, right? So it's harder for you to have cards combo with themselves. And that way, it'll be difficult. Now, it's still possible to, do all this stuff, but you do kind of make it difficult. Another obvious question is that if, we have a limited list and other cards a max of 4, is that really enough to, minimize the balanced cards? Remember the previous deck was only 40 cards, right? So you have a limited list. There's 9 cards you pretty much want to have. That's 31 other cards. Is that, that enough? Well, the simple solution was to just up the deck. So the minimum deck size was 40. Now it's 60. Now you have limited cards, and it's harder for you to get those cards to kind of break the game quicker, and it's harder to combo if there's other unforeseen mechanic interactions. Now, the new rules did ban the anti-specific cards. Like we said, they did the opposite. You had to agree to anti, but because anti was banned, as in by default, as in you had to agree to it, these cards were banned as part of tournaments. Now, personally, for me, in my opinion, Anti was legal. The first tournament didn't play it. Anti cards aren't really balanced. Contract for below is it's basically you're paying 1 mana to draw 7 cards. Effectively, add 1 to the anti. Demonic Attorney. There's lots of shenanigans you can do with anti. The anti cards were mostly in black in the beginning. They added other cards over time, so they weren't really balanced to begin with. So in my opinion, this was probably a good move. They'd introduced the 15 card sideboard as part of this, and the idea was that they could exchange cards 1 for 1, like we mentioned earlier. And the stated reasons for this was to introduce variety in play and to test skill of players to a higher degree. And you can kind of see the exact wording they used for that. And you can see the link there. Now, the stated reason is to increase variety of play and, and reward higher skilled players. But what's the real primary reason? Well, it's really just to reduce the effectiveness of cheesy decks. So, like we showed you earlier, it is possible to make decks and play structures where you win turn 1. And so the goal is to make that less likely, and you have to be more strategic and a overall better player. So how do we make it so that players, that go forward in tournaments, that win tournaments, aren't just lucky? What can we do to, stack the odds in favor of them? Well, one of the simple answers is that you make default tournaments 2 out of 3. So in other words, you have to, if you are playing a cheesy deck, if you're playing kind of a pure random deck where you're trying to get your combo off, and that's pretty much all you have there of substance, you've got to do this twice. And so it's harder for you to get, kind of have your cheesy deck win twice if that's all you have. You're not skilled on top of it. And so, yeah, that makes sense. But is there anything more we can do to give skilled players an edge, to give them a better chance of winning advancing? Not just the cheesy player, not just the broken one-off hard to get combos, but they're possible. Well, the answer to that question is that you add in sideboards. And if you have a sideboards, players can switch out cards in and out so they can better defend themselves against their opponent's cheesy strategy and their cheesy decks. And that gives the skilled players an edge. So we have all these new deck building rules. 60 card minimum, limited list, regular list, max 4. We have a ban list of cards. We have a sideboard. But how do we enforce all these restrictions, all these new rules? Well, the answer is deck lists. More specifically, written deck lists submitted on sheets, submitted prior to tournament start. So, written submitted deck lists create a written record of what should be played by a player. Primary purpose is to help enforce the limited list and the max of 4 copies rule in tournaments and games. It does help enforce ban cards because you shouldn't put a ban card on that list. Secondary purpose is to help ensure players don't switch decks and add administrative burden. We'll talk more about that later. It is a self-enforcement mechanism because players have to fill out their own deck lists, and they are themselves helping make sure that their own decks meet requirements. Now, there are some practical realities preventing, a full deck swapping. So the question is why not just, why 15 cards? Why not 60 cards? Why not everything? Why even bother? Well, the basic issue for this is that if you allow full deck swapping, this makes deck list checking and verification more cumbersome administratively. That's the problem. So if we did allow that, it'd be harder for judges or tournament organizers to deck check effectively, right? Did he use his deck list from round 2, game 3, or round 3, game 2? It's a legitimate question. It's harder to do it, so it makes them less effective. If switching decks were allowed, it would be easier for players to make mistakes. So, example, maybe Jim, switches cards between decks. So maybe a player count his deck, says, Jim, your deck is only 58 cards. Did you forget to take cards from your previous deck and put into this one? So it takes time, it takes effort, between, players have multiple decks, maybe they made the same cards between deck 1 and deck 2. There's chances for mistakes, errors, etc., which can slow things down and make things bad. Furthermore, it would increase delays between games to some degree, right? So, Rick, we were supposed to play 5 minutes ago. Choose a deck and let's start already, right? So, it could become a delaying tactic, even if not, on purpose. So sideboards themselves, would be a compromise, right? Because don't all of these things, why allow sideboards, right? So remember that the stated purpose of sideboards is to introduce variety play, test player skill to a high degree. The real purpose is to just reduce effectiveness cheesy decks and make skilled players more likely to win. They do inherently add more strategic burden. It takes more time to check 75 cards than 60 cards. They do increase the mistake chances some, because it is possible, even though it's supposed to be 1-for-1, you could accidentally put 2 cards from the sideboard in and 1 card from the main deck out. So mistakes could happen because you're switching. And of course, it does take time between these games of a match to figure out which cards you're going to swap in or not. So there is some thinking involved, there is some delay. So you do have to ask yourself the question of, would full deck swaps introduce more or less variety? Well, absolutely. Full deck swaps will add more variety to games, which is one reason why they said to have sideboards. You can ask yourself the question of, would allowing full deck swaps test player skill to a high degree? And the answer to that is absolutely. If you are allowed to swap out more than 15 cards, that would test your skill, because you have to be prepared against more cards in order to do that. You have to prepare against more decks. What do I use now? So the sideboards themselves are a compromise solution, right? It's easier to check 75 cards than 120 cards. It's easier to check one deck of 75 cards than 2 decks, 3 decks, 4 decks, right? For administrators, right? Swapping deck between main deck and sideboard, there is some risk of making mistakes, but certainly less risk than 2 full decks, for example. And it does take time to think about which cards you want to swap in or out, but certainly, think about, of these 15 cards, these are the only things I can swap in and out, rather than thinking, what deck should I play next? Swap in 60 potentially, right? And obviously, needing to win 2 out of 3 games help advance skilled players, like we mentioned, and being able to swap some cards, even if not a full deck, does give an edge to skilled players, even if it's less of an edge or less variety than a full additional 60. All right, there are some other benefits to deck lists themselves. We didn't have deck lists from the first 1993 Magic the Gathering tournament, and it is nice to know what was the best deck, right? So there were some recreations, like we mentioned earlier with the 1993 decks, but we don't know what they were. However, we do have the deck list for the 2 winners of the 1994 World Championships, and we can marvel at kind of their deck and their skill and kind of what happened. So the winning deck was a Sarah Angel deck, mostly. You can see the link there. The second place winner was kind of a Kurt Abe Zoo deck. You can see the link there. But both very cool, very very fun to look at. What was the optimal decks at the time, right? And to be fair, it is cleaner to say this was the deck played by the winner for this tournament, and we are going to say this was the best deck because it won, rather than say these are the decks played by the winner, and they're probably the best decks, and To be fair, though, granted, the sideboard does muddle the best a little bit because it's kind of what you chose the sideboard at the time. Summary. So, you want to know why Star Wars CCG decks are 60 cards, and they try very hard to punish copies of cards in the design with cards such as Monarch and Grimtosh. If you want to know why Lord of the Rings TCG decks are minimum 60 cards, and that they have maximum 4 copies of a card, so no infinite double shots for you, you can blame Magic the Gathering. If you want to know why Star Wars CCG and Lord of the Ring tournaments require deck lists, a couple examples here. Well, you can blame Magic the Gathering for that too. Summary. Magic the Gathering's initial design was very imbalanced. It needed fixing, so they implemented a ban list, a limited list, regular card max of 4, 60 card minimum decks, and deck lists required for tournaments to enforce all of the above new rules. And to further make it harder for cheesy decks and less skilled players to advance, they instituted a method of tournament matches are best 2 out of 3 by default, and they introduced sideboards of exactly 15 cards so that players could switch cards one for one with those decks in order to win. Stated reasons for sideboards were introduce writing play and test player skill to a higher degree. Allowing full deck swapping would theoretically do that even more. However, the real issues of administrative burden, increased mistake chances, and delays between games prevented full deck swapping from being the norm. Magic the Gathering's rule set introduced in January 1994 set standards for every CCG game after it. They either adopted these wholesale or they subverted it slightly. 60 card decks is the norm, card limits are the norm, Rin tournament deck lists are the norm, and they proved that design issues can be addressed, even if they're imperfect, through various means, and they proved that long-lasting gameplay and fun in CCGs is very achievable. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think. Please do click some of the links I have in the description to join the 2026 Retro Game PC and the 2026 Retro Java Championship. They are free to join. We do have participation prizes. Hope you all sign up and hope to see you there. Take care. Bye-bye.